Hey guys, so I'm out here putting back together my WRX engine with new turbo and did my valve stem seals now, and I'm getting back to putting the timing belt on it. And I want to show you something about engines that you've eliminated the AVCS on. This is common if you're putting an engine that came out of basically any turbo 2.5 USDM is an AVCS engine. So if you're swapping this into your 02 to 04 WRX, or sorry, 02 to 05 WRX, any car that came with a 2-liter engine, you need to address the AVCS. And this piece that I'm going to talk about, I've never heard anyone else address. So when I started out doing this swap, my background in messing with domestic cars, American muscle cars, doing cam swaps and stuff. The intake center line, exhaust center line, the camshaft events are important. And everyone kind of knows that. People know, you're supposed to degree in your cam. That's not generally worried about in the import world unless you're running an aftermarket cam, adjustable gears, any of that stuff. But my thought was, hey, let me make sure that the cam timing is where it should be when I put the non-AVCS gears on my AVCS camshafts. And I wanted to leave the 2.5 camshafts in, mainly because they have just not mainly. They have a hair more lift. They're 378 and 384 lift on the intake and exhaust instead of 365 and 361. So that's a little bit helpful. But more importantly, I didn't want to get involved with reshimming any of the buckets. This uses the shimless buckets. The EJ205 uses the shims. Anyway, I wanted to check the cam timing, and I'm glad I did because no one really talks about this. But the intake center line angle of these AVCS cams is 125 degrees. The exhaust center line's 115. And this is in the resting position. Whether you put the AVCS cam gear on or the non-AVCS cam gear, you will have roughly 125 degree intake center line angle. There's some variance in there. It could be plus or minus a degree or two. I actually measured 122. That's okay. But it's supposed to be 125. That's a really late or retarded intake center line angle for pretty much any application. That combined with the 115 degree exhaust center line angle gives you a lobe separation of 120, which is also very wide. This is the late center line angle in a wide LSA is what you would want under boost at high RPM, but it's going to kill a lot of mid-range torque. It's going to make the engine feel less responsive down low, out of boost, around where peak torque should be. And it's going to move your peak torque up. The EJ205 is, and so the reason that it's retarded is the cam gear in the natural position, the AVCS cam gear is in the most retarded position, and it advances from there. And that's the reason for that. So what will happen is if you're doing an AVCS elimination, you have to block the ports behind the cam gear that feed the gear. But what will happen is you'll end up with that 125 degree intake center line angle. You'll have an engine that feels more sluggish on the bottom end, has lower cranking compression. Actually, I know exactly what the cranking compression was in this engine when it had the 125 degree intake center line angle, and it was 145-ish pounds. Now, the EJ205 uses very more conventional cam specs. 110 degree intake center line angle, which is very standard for a smaller camshaft, 113 degree exhaust center line angle, 111.5 lobe separation angle, and like I said before, a little less lift. The 110 degree intake center line angle bumps the crank compression to about 170, even almost 175 pounds. So that's a big difference. It makes a big difference on the low end. I've worked on cars that had AVCS issues and the AVCS wasn't working, and these engines feel very sluggish with 125-degree intake center line angle. I can tell you that. The duration between the 2.5 and the 2.0 cams is basically the same. The 2.0 is 205 on intake and exhaust at 50 thousandths. These 255 cams are supposed to be 204 on the intake and 208 on the exhaust. Basically net nothing. You might have noticed I point out the exhaust center line difference. The EJ205 is a 113 exhaust center line. This 255 is a 115 exhaust center line. So the exhaust cam is 2 degrees more advanced. That is not a problem. The 2 degrees is, you're never going to notice the 2 degrees. The net effect of it is it's going to take away a little bit of mid-range torque and add a little bit up top, but 2 degrees, you're never going to feel it. And, you know, I guess you have a tiny bit less overlap. But again, 1 degree less overlap, you're never going to know it. You're never going to know the difference. So I guess it'd be 2 degrees less overlap, but the duration on the cams are slightly different. So I don't know exactly how that plays out. But what you want to do, if you want the 110 intake center line angle here, is you need to advance your intake cams. There's 48 teeth on these intake cams. So that's 7.5 degrees per tooth. You do 360 divided by 48, you get 7.5 degrees. But remember, the cam gear spins at half the speed of the crankshaft. So 7.5 cam degrees is actually 15 crank degrees. So it works out perfectly that if you turn this cam 1 tooth clockwise, so you can see I've put a timing mark, 1 tooth counterclockwise here and up here. If you turn the cam 1 degree or 1 tooth clockwise, you're advancing the intake cam exactly to 110 intake center line angle. So it's exactly where you want it to be. And then the exhaust is 2 degrees difference. You're not worried about that. You couldn't even do that without an adjustable cam gear. So again, you just turn the cam 1 tooth clockwise. So 1 tooth counterclockwise from the standard timing marks. I've added additional marks. And same thing on this intake cam. And I was in here, so I cleaned this with brake clean, and unfortunately wore them off a little bit. You can see 1 tooth counterclockwise. So we're advancing the cam 1 tooth clockwise. Down here, this mark's a little bit harder to see, but it's there. And then everything else goes where it goes. You just move the intake cams. And yeah, that's pretty much it. If you're looking for a tip on, if you've never done a timing belt on one of these Subaru engines before, these marks sometimes don't line up perfectly. And, you know, you'll start to wonder, is that off a tooth or not? Just remember, a tooth off is a big jump, right? So if you're off a tooth, the timing mark's going to be pointing over here or over here or over here or over there. So don't sweat it. The marks are not that precise. You can see that one's almost off a tooth, but I know that that's just kind of always the way it is. And my belt has the nice lines on it, so I know everything's where it's supposed to be. But yeah, so if you're eliminating AVCS, I highly recommend you advance your intake cams by 1 tooth, put them on the same 110 intake center line angle that the EJ205 already has, and your engine will be a lot snappier. You'll be happy you did it.